Welcome, everyone. Today, we'll discuss one of the most important aspects of colonial exploitation in India, and that is the drain of wealth theory. The idea of drain wealth refers to the continuous flow of resources, revenues, and profits from India to Britain with no adequate return. For nearly 2 centuries, India was systematically impoverished, while Britain became one of the richest nations in the world. Our agenda is clear. First, we will discuss the meaning of wealth drain and how it shaped the colonial economy. Then, we will look at India's prosperity before colonial rule, which makes the decline under the British even more striking. After that, we will trace the early phases of wealth drain, beginning with East India Company after the Battle of Plassey in 1757. A key section will be on Dadabhai Nauroji's drain of wealth theory, the first scientific explanation of how Britain was enriching itself at India's expense. We will then break down the main mechanisms of the drain, trade policies, taxation, high salaries, and pensions of officials, public works like railways, and military expenditure. Later, we will explore the impact of this drain on agriculture, industry, and society, with particular focus on famines and poverty. We will also study how Indian intellectuals and leaders criticize this exploitation and how the theory of wealth drain fueled nationalism. By the end of this lecture, we will see clearly why the drain of wealth was described as the greatest crime in history. When we speak of a wealth drain, we are talking about the systematic transfer of India's resources to Britain without any return benefit to Indians. One historian described it as, to quote, loot and plunder by the British for more than 200 years. While India was totally drained, Britain flourished on this economic loot. Britain's Industrial Revolution was built on the destruction of India's thriving manufacturing industries. Unquote. This perfectly summarizes the meaning of wealth drain. Britain's prosperity was not an independent achievement. It was closely linked to the deliberate impoverishment of India. Every element of colonial policy, from taxation to trade restrictions, was designed to ensure that wealth flowed out of India. India was reduced to a colonial economy, a supplier of cheap raw material and a consumer of expensive British finished goods. Revenues collected in India were used not for India's welfare but to pay for British officials, soldiers, and wars abroad. Even so called development projects like railways were built mainly to facilitate exports and imports that benefited Britain. Thus, wealth drain was not just about economics, it was also about morality and justice. A prosperous and self reliant civilization was deliberately reduced to dependency and poverty. This concept became central to the nationalist critique of colonialism, showing that independence was essential for India's economic survival. To understand the magnitude of the drain, we must remember how wealthy India was before colonial domination. At the beginning of the 18th centuries, India's share of the world economy was around 23 to 27%, equal to all of Europe put together. The Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb's treasury alone collected 500 million rupees in annual taxes. Such figure show India's prosperity. India was famous for its textiles. Bengal's muslin, Gujarat's cotton, and Varanasi's silk were exported to Egypt, Turkey, Java, China, Japan, and Europe. Bengal's annual textile exports in 1750s were worth 16 million rupees. A Western observer noted that India was a far greater industrial and manufacturing nation than any in Europe or in any other part of the world. Nearly every product valued for beauty or utility was produced here, from fabrics and jewelry to shipbuilding and metalwork. India was not backward, It was at the forefront of global trade and manufacturing. This background is important because it shows that what was lost. India was not a poor country waiting to be modernized. It was a rich and advanced economy that was deliberately plundered. The wealth drain was not natural decline but result of colonial exploitation. The drain of wealth began soon after the Battle of Plassey in 1757 when the East India Company gained control over Bengal. Bengal's immense revenues became the foundation of company power. As one French observer noted, there are few kings in Europe richer than the directors of the English East India Company. The early phase was characterized by outright plunder. Company officials extracted wealth through coercive taxation, trade monopolies, and corruption. The dual role of officials as traders and administrators meant they could manipulate markets and enrich themselves at the expense of India. Revenues from Bengal were not reinvested locally. Instead, they were sent to England to pay dividends to company shareholders. This set the pattern of drain. Wealth flowed out, but nothing flowed in or came back. Indian industries, especially textiles, were deliberately suppressed to make way for British goods. This period also saw the start of the so-called home charges, payments for pensions, salaries, and military expenses that had to be met from Indian revenues. India was made to pay not only for its administration but also for the expansion of British power abroad. Thus, the early phase of wealth drain hollowed out India's economy. What had once been a rich region capable of supporting artisans, farmers, and traders was turned into a colony whose wealth financed Britain's rise. One of the greatest contributors to our understanding of colonial exploitation came from Dadabhai Naoroji. He was the first to provide a clear and systematic explanation of how India's wealth was drained by Britain. His famous drain theory became the foundation of nationalist economic thought. Naroji pointed out that India was exporting goods worth millions of pounds to Britain each year, but receiving nothing in return. Profits from these exports, along with salaries of officials and pensions of soldiers, were all sent abroad. He estimated that nearly 30 million pounds were drained annually. This was not reinvested in India, but used only to enrich Britain. He explained that India was made to pay for its own administration and exploitation, in fact, and also for wars fought by Britishers elsewhere and not for India. Half of Indian revenues were being spent abroad, leaving little for the welfare of the people. As a result, poverty spread despite India's natural wealth and hard work. Naroji argued that this drain was the chief cause of India's growing poverty, and he said clearly that the un British rule was responsible for the misery of Indian masses. Why un British? Because Britain by that time was known for the values of liberalism, equality, justice, and the British rule in India was in sharp contradiction to the British values of liberty, equality, and respect and justice. His analysis was not only economic but also moral, showing that Britain's prosperity was built on injustice. The drain theory inspired generations of nationalists. It gave them a powerful argument that independence was necessary, not only for political freedom but also for economic survival. One of the main channels of wealth drain was Britain's trade policy. India had been a leading exporter of textiles and handicrafts, but under colonial rule, this was totally destroyed. Heavy duties of 70 to 80% were imposed on Indian goods entering Britain, while British goods entering India entered India almost free of duty. This created an unfair trade balance. Indian textiles, once admired worldwide, lost their markets. At the same time, cheap British cloth flooded Indian markets, replacing hand woven Indian fabrics. Skilled weavers and artisans were left jobless, and whole communities sank into poverty. India was also reduced to a supplier of raw materials. Cotton, jute, indigo, and opium were grown in India and exported at low price. In return, India had to import finished goods at high prices. This means that the value addition took place in Britain, not in India. The result was a one way flow of wealth. India's trade surplus was drained to Britain, while India itself faced poverty and industrial decline. Britain's Industrial Revolution was fueled by this policy. As one historian observed, to quote, Britain's looms worked with Indian cotton while India's looms lay silent. Thus, colonial trade policy was not free trade but forced trade. It destroyed India's industries and made the country dependent on British imports. This was a central mechanism of the wealth drain. Another key mechanism of the wealth drain was taxation through the land revenue systems of Zamindari, Rayatwari, and Mahalwari, which were designed to maximize revenue, not to support farmers. Taxes were often as high as 50% of the produce and had to be paid in cash. Even in years of drought or famine, peasants had no relaxation, and if they failed, land was confiscated or auctioned. Reports describe peasants being locked in cages, exposed to the burning sun, beaten for default. Some families were even forced to sell their children. These were not just economic hardships but acts of inhumanity. The revenue collected was not used for local development. Instead, it was transferred to Britain or used to pay for colonial administration and the army. Indian villages received nothing in return for their taxes. The cash payment system made things worse, and the farmers had to sell their crops at low prices in the market. This pushed them into permanent debt to moneylenders. In this way, taxation became an instrument of exploitation. It drained the wealth of Indian villages and transferred it to Britain. It also destroyed traditional rights and created a class of landless laborers. The burden of taxation was one of the strongest proof of the wealth drain. A large part of this drain came through what were known as home charges. These were payments made from Indian revenues for the expenses of British officials and institutions outside India. High salaries of civil servants and military officers in India were paid from Indian taxes. But once these officials retired, they returned to Britain, taking their pensions with them. This meant that Indian revenues continued to flow abroad even after the officials had left India. Company shareholders in Britain also received dividends paid from Indian income. Judges, governors, and generals drew salaries far higher than any Indian could dream of, and all of it came from the taxes of ordinary peasants and workers. It was estimated that millions of pounds left India each year in this way. One contemporary remarked that India is bled of her wealth to pay for own subjugation. This captures the injustice of the system. These salaries and pensions were not reinvested in India. They were spent in Britain, stimulating its economy while draining India's. Over time, the constant outflow of wealth left India impoverished with little capital for development. Thus, the system of high salaries and pensions was not just an administrative expense, it was a deliberate mechanism to ensure that Indian wealth supported British prosperity. The British often claimed that they introduced modern public works in India, such as railways, canals, and telegraphs. At first glance, these appears to be signs of development. But when we examine closely, we find that these projects were also major instruments of wealth drain. Railways, for example, were built mainly to carry raw materials like cotton, jute, and coal from the interiors to ports for export to Britain. Finished goods from Britain were then transported back to Indian markets. The purpose was not to integrate Indian villages or boost internal trade, but to strengthen colonial extraction by improving connectivity. These projects were financed by Indian revenues. The government guaranteed high returns to British investors, meaning that the risks were borne by India while the profits went abroad. In the case of railways, the capital came from London, but interest payments came from Indian taxpayers. Canals and irrigation works followed a similar pattern. They often benefited cash crops like indigo and cotton, grown for export rather than food crops for Indian consumption. Thus, while public works appeared modern, they were structured to serve British interests. They deepened India's dependence, drained resources through guaranteed returns, and left little space for local needs. What looked like development was, in reality, another channel for drain of wealth. Another major channel of wealth drain was military expenditure. Maintaining the British Indian Army consumed an enormous share of India's revenues. In some years, 60 to 70% of total income went to defense related expenses. This army was not meant to protect India, it was used to expand and safeguard Britain's global empire. Indian soldiers fought in Afghanistan, Burma, China, and even Europe during the world wars. Yet the costs were borne entirely by Indian taxpayers. The Indian Army also played a role in suppressing resistance within India. Famines, protests, and uprisings were often met with military force. This meant that Indians were financing an army that was used to keep them in subjugation. Military pensions were another burden. Retired officers went back to England with generous pensions paid from Indian revenues. This became part of the home charges, contributing to the steady outflow of wealth. Thus, military expenditure was a double exploitation. On one hand, it drained India's financial resources. On the other hand, it forced Indians to pay for the very army that maintained colonial rule over them. As critics observed, India was bled white to support the expansion and security of Britain's empire. The drain of wealth had devastating consequences for Indian agriculture. Farmers were forced to cultivate cash crops like cotton, indigo, and opium for exports, often under pressures from colonial officials. This reduced the cultivation of food grains, leaving India vulnerable to shortages. When more land was diverted to cash crops, less was available for rice, wheat, and pulses. Famines became more frequent and severe because food production could not keep pace with population needs. Grain exports continued even during times of scarcity as revenue and trade interests were given priority over human survival. The emphasis on monocultures damaged soil fertility, continuous cultivation of the same crops reduced productivity, and made farmers dependent on markets. Fluctuations in global prices often ruin entire community. Farmers also faced crushing debt to pay heavy land taxes in cash they borrowed from moneylenders at high interest. Failure to repay meant losing their land. Many cultivators were reduced to tenant farmers or laborers on land they once owned. Thus, agriculture, which had once sustained India's prosperity, was transformed into a sector of insecurity and misery. It no longer served Indian needs but was reshaped to serve Britain's industries and global trade. This was one of the clearest outcomes of the wealth drain. The impact of wealth drain on Indian industry was equally destructive. India, as mentioned earlier, had once been a leader in manufacturing, especially textiles, had under the colonial trade policies, had to dismantle this entire sector. Heavy tariffs were imposed on Indian goods entering Britain, while British textiles entered India freely. Indian weavers, once celebrated for their skills, were unable to compete with cheap machine made cloth from Manchester. Accounts describe looms being destroyed and weavers left destitute. India's share of world textile trade, once 25%, fell to almost nothing by the 19th century. Other industries also suffered. Shipbuilding, once strong on the eastern and western coast, was discouraged by British regulations. Metallurgy and handicrafts declined as artisans lost their market. Traditional urban centers like Dhaka, Murshidabad, and Surat went into economic decline. At the same time, Britain's industrial revolution flourished. Indian raw cotton fueled the mills of Lancashire, while Indian markets absorbed British manufactured goods. The prosperity of Britain was built on the deliberate destruction of Indian industry. This was not modernization but deindustrialization. A once thriving manufacturing economy was reduced to dependence on imports. The drain of wealth ensured that India could not develop its own industries, leaving a legacy of economic backwardness that persisted long after independence. One of the most tragic consequences of the wealth drain was the recurrence of famines and the deepening of poverty. Famines were not unknown in the past, but under British rule they became more frequent and more deadly. This was because colonial policies prioritized revenue collection and exports over human survival. The Bengal famine of 1770 killed nearly 10 million people, about one third of the province's population. During this disaster, revenue demands were not reduced and grain continued to be exported. In the 19th century, famines in Madras, Bombay, and the Deccan killed more than 20 million people. The Great Famine of 1876-78 alone claimed 5 to 6 million lives. Officials often argued that they could not interfere with free trade. In practice, this meant that while people starved, merchants continued to export grain abroad. The colonial state provided little relief, and whatever was offered was inadequate. Poverty deepened alongside these tragedies. As one writer observed, to quote, India was bled for her wealth and reduced to a skeleton nation. By the late 19th century, malnutrition, disease, and low life expectancy became widespread. Thus, famines were not merely natural calamities, they were man made disasters rooted in the policies of drain and exploitation. They revealed the cruelty of a system that valued profit over human life. The idea of wealth drain did not remain unnoticed. Indian leaders, intellectuals, and even some foreign observers sharply criticized the policies that impoverished India. Dadabhai Naoroji laid the foundation with his drain theory, showing how resources were systematically uh, siphoned off. He described British rule as un British because it violated the very principles of justice Britain claimed to uphold. R.C. Dutt expanded on R.C. Dutt expanded on Nauroji's work, documenting how economic policies destroyed agriculture and industries. He argued that the constant drain of resources explained India's poverty despite its natural wealth. William Digby, a British writer, criticized famine policy and held the government responsible for preventable deaths. Indian press also played a role. Newspapers exposed cases of exploitation and highlighted the sufferings caused by high taxation, famines, and trade imbalances. These critiques reached wider audiences and fueled national debates. Critics argued that the drain was not just economic theft, but also a moral crime. A country was being systematically impoverished to support another nation's prosperity. It was called the greatest crime in history. Such critiques gave intellectual depth to the freedom struggle. They provided evidence that independence was not just desirable, but essential to end this exploitation. The concept of wealth drain became a powerful tool in the rise of Indian nationalism. Economic grievances affected people across regions, religions, and classes, creating a common ground for resistance. Leaders connected poverty and unemployment directly to colonial exploitation. The Swadeshi movement of 1905 was one of the clearest expressions of this response. Indians boycotted foreign goods and promoted indigenous industries as a way to resist economic drain. Gandhi later strengthened this tradition, focusing on indigo cultivation in Champaran and the salt tax in his Salt March. Both highlighted how everyday economic practices were linked to colonial exploitation. Even Swadeshi and boycott, Tilak and a number of extremist leaders played a very significant role in introducing or highlighting Swadeshi and boycotting the British goods. Speeches and writings of leaders repeatedly emphasized that independence was not just political freedom but also economic liberation. Nauroji's drain theory was cited in debates in the British Parliament itself, proving that the nationalist arguments had international reach. Nationalist organizations also use the language of wealth drain to mobilize masses. They explained that every tax paid, every yard of British cloth purchased, and every acre used for cash crops contributed to India's poverty. Thus, the wealth drain theory unified intellectual critique with mass movements. It became one of the central reasons why nationalism grew strong and why independence became an urgent demand. The legacy of wealth drain was devastating. By the time India gained independence in 1947, its share of the world's GDP had shrunk from nearly a quarter in 1700 to just around 3%. A nation that had once been called the Golden Bird was left poor and dependent. The industrial base had been destroyed, traditional crafts and textiles had collapsed, and India had failed to develop modern industries under colonial constraints. Agriculture remained stagnant, overburdened, and vulnerable to crisis. Millions of peasants were landless, trapped in cycles of debt. The social impact were equally severe. Poverty, malnutrition, illiteracy, and unemployment became widespread. Health indicators were dismal, with low life expectancy and high infant mortality. Women and marginalized groups were especially disadvantaged. This legacy posed enormous challenges for independent India. Leaders had to focus on rebuilding industries, reforming agriculture, and planning for self sufficiency, not in industrial goods but in food grains. The emphasis on economic planning and development in the early years of independence reflected the urgent need to reverse centuries of exploitation. For decades, we were striving to gain self dependency in food grains, leave aside uh, heavy industries, metals, or in other industrial goods. At the same time, the wealth drain left behind a strong nationalist memory. It reminded Indians why freedom had been necessary and why economic justice had to be a priority. The scars of exploitation remained, but so did the determination to build a self reliant nation. Thank you.